Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up because the economic battlefield is heating up and the sparks are flying across the northern border. During his first term, Donald Trump made it clear that he was willing to shake up long-standing trade relationships in the name of protecting American industries. One of the most controversial moves he made was imposing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in 2018. This decision sent shockwaves through the economies of both nations and set the stage for ongoing trade tensions that are now resurfacing as he eyes another term in office. The 2018 tariffs were introduced under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allowed the U.S. government to impose tariffs on imports that were deemed a threat to national security. Trump argued that the American steel and aluminum industries were being undermined by foreign competition, including from Canada, and that protective measures were necessary to ensure the U.S. maintained strong domestic production capabilities. However, this move was met with intense backlash, especially given that Canada had been a long-standing ally of the U.S. and one of its largest trading partners. The tariffs placed a 25% tax on Canadian steel and a 10% tax on aluminum, significantly increasing costs for American businesses that relied on these materials. The impact was immediate. Automakers, construction companies, and manufacturers in the U.S. faced higher production costs, which were then passed down to consumers. Many American businesses warned that these tariffs would do more harm than good, making products more expensive and potentially causing job losses rather than protecting them. Canada, which exports the majority of its steel and aluminum to the U.S., did not take the move lightly. In response, the Canadian government, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, imposed retaliatory tariffs on $16 billion worth of American goods. These countermeasures targeted politically significant industries, including agricultural products like ketchup, whiskey, and dairy, as well as steel and aluminum products coming from the U.S. The goal was clear: apply economic pressure to key American industries and force Trump to rethink his trade policies. The trade war created tensions between the two governments, despite the deep economic and cultural ties between the two nations. Trudeau publicly condemned the tariffs, calling them insulting and unacceptable, particularly since Canada had fought alongside the U.S. in multiple wars and had always been considered a strategic partner rather than a threat. In return, Trump doubled down, calling Canada's trade practices unfair and even engaging in a war of words with Trudeau, labeling him weak and dishonest. The standoff lasted for over a year, causing significant disruptions in trade. American businesses that relied on Canadian steel and aluminum, including major automakers like General Motors and Ford, faced rising costs. In Canada, industries that depended on exports to the U.S. struggled with declining revenues. Both economies felt the pinch, and the tension only eased when a deal was struck in 2019, which saw the removal of these tariffs under the revised United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. But even though the tariffs were lifted, the damage had been done. The trust between the two nations had been shaken, and Canada had begun looking at ways to reduce its reliance on U.S. trade. More importantly, the entire ordeal proved that Trump was willing to use tariffs as a weapon of economic pressure, even against traditional allies. Now, as Trump seeks a return to the White House, he has once again floated the idea of universal tariffs on imports, which could reignite tensions with Canada. If history is any indication, his administration would not hesitate to reintroduce steel and aluminum tariffs or even broader trade restrictions to push his America First agenda. Given how closely integrated the Canadian and American economies are, another round of tariffs could lead to severe consequences for both nations, making it clear that the trade war that started in 2018 is far from over. Donald Trump has never been shy about his belief that the United States has been taken advantage of in global trade. Throughout his presidency and beyond, he has criticized what he sees as unfair trade practices, not just from rivals like China, but also from long-standing allies, including Canada. Now, as he positions himself for a potential return to the White House, he has revived one of his most controversial economic ideas: universal tariffs on all imports. Unlike targeted tariffs, which apply to specific industries or countries, Universal tariffs would impose a blanket tax on every imported good, regardless of its origin. Trump has suggested a baseline tariff of 10% on all imports, with some goods potentially facing even higher rates. This is a drastic shift from traditional U.S. trade policy, which has relied on negotiated trade deals and targeted measures rather than across-the-board import taxes. The impact of such a policy would be far-reaching, and Canada, as the United States' largest trading partner, would undoubtedly feel the effects. The economic relationship between the U.S. And Canada is massive. Every day, over $2.6 billion worth of goods and services cross the border, making Canada the #1 destination for American exports and one of the largest sources of imports. A universal tariff would mean that every single product coming into the U.S. from Canada, whether it be automobiles, lumber, oil, or agricultural products, would be hit with a new tax. This would not only disrupt supply chains, but also drive up costs for American businesses and consumers. One of the industries that would be most affected is the automotive sector. American and Canadian car manufacturers have deeply integrated supply chains, with parts and components often crossing the border multiple times before a vehicle is fully assembled. If Trump enforces a universal tariff, the cost of producing cars in North America could rise significantly, leading to higher prices for consumers and potential job losses in both countries. The energy sector would also feel the impact. The United States imports a significant portion of its crude oil from Canada, particularly from Alberta's oil sands. A universal tariff could raise the cost of energy in the U.S., affecting industries that rely on affordable fuel and potentially increasing gas prices for American consumers. Given the global nature of energy markets, this move could also push Canada to diversify its energy exports away from the U.S. and towards other buyers, such as China or Europe. Beyond economic concerns, a universal tariff policy could strain diplomatic relations between the two nations. Canada has long been one of America's closest allies, supporting the U.S. in conflicts, intelligence sharing, and economic cooperation. However, Trump's trade policies have repeatedly challenged this partnership, and another round of aggressive tariffs could lead to further diplomatic tensions. Canadian officials have already expressed concerns over Trump's return and the potential for another trade war similar to the steel and aluminum disputes of 2018. If universal tariffs are imposed, Canada will likely retaliate with countermeasures, as it did in response to previous U.S. tariffs. This could mean new taxes on American agricultural goods, consumer products, and industrial materials, increasing costs for businesses and consumers on both sides of the border. Additionally, Canada may seek to strengthen trade ties with other partners, reducing its economic reliance on the U.S. market. While Trump argues that universal tariffs will protect American jobs and encourage domestic production, economists warn that the policy could backfire by raising prices, disrupting industries, and damaging relationships with key allies. History has shown that trade wars often lead to unintended consequences, and if Trump moves forward with this plan, Canada will be among the first nations to feel the economic shockwaves. As Trump's trade policies continue to take shape, businesses and governments in both countries must prepare for a new era of uncertainty. The threat of universal tariffs isn't just a theoretical campaign promise, it's a real possibility that could redefine U.S. Canada trade for years to come. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada is one of the strongest and most interconnected in the world. Every day, over $2.6 billion worth of goods and services flow across the border, supporting millions of jobs and industries in both countries. If Donald Trump follows through with his plan to impose universal tariffs on all imports, the economic consequences could be severe, disrupting supply chains, increasing costs, and putting both Canadian and American jobs at risk. One of the industries that would be hit the hardest is automotive manufacturing. The U.S. and Canada share an integrated auto industry, with car parts and components crossing the border multiple times during production. For example, an engine block cast in Ontario may be shipped to Michigan for machining, then sent back to Canada for assembly before being installed in a vehicle at a final U.S. plant. This complex system allows manufacturers to operate efficiently and keep costs down. However, if a 10% universal tariff is imposed on all imports, every cross-border transaction would become more expensive. These additional costs would be passed down to consumers, making vehicles more expensive in both countries. The agriculture sector would also face major disruptions. Canada exports billions of dollars worth of beef, pork, wheat, dairy, and fresh produce to the United States. A blanket tariff on these products would raise prices for American consumers while simultaneously hurting Canadian farmers who rely on the U.S. as their primary market. Additionally, American agricultural exports to Canada, such as corn, soybeans, and processed foods, could suffer if Canada retaliates with its own tariffs, as it has done in previous trade disputes. This could lead to supply chain disruptions and financial struggles for farmers on both sides of the border. Another major area of concern is the energy sector. The U.S. imports a significant amount of oil, natural gas, and electricity from Canada, particularly from Alberta's oil sands. If a tariff is placed on Canadian energy products, American refineries and power plants would face higher costs, potentially leading to higher fuel prices for U.S. consumers. At the same time, Canada could look to diversify its energy exports away from the U.S., strengthening trade relationships with countries like China, India, and the European Union. This shift could have long-term consequences, reducing American access to Canadian energy and making the U.S. more reliant on other, less stable energy supplies. Beyond these industries, small businesses and consumers will also feel the effects. Many American companies, particularly those in retail and manufacturing, rely on affordable Canadian imports to keep prices competitive. If these goods become more expensive due to tariffs, businesses may have to cut costs elsewhere, potentially through layoffs or price increases. Consumers would see higher prices on everything from groceries and home goods to cars and appliances, reducing their purchasing power and slowing economic growth. The job market in both countries is also at risk. In the United States, millions of jobs depend on trade with Canada, particularly in industries like manufacturing, agriculture, and energy. If tariffs disrupt this trade, companies may be forced to cut jobs or relocate operations. In Canada, the reliance on the U.S. market means that any major disruption could lead to economic downturns in key sectors, causing job losses and uncertainty for workers. Finally, the broader North American economy could be destabilized. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, was designed to create a stable and predictable trade environment for all three nations. If Trump imposes universal tariffs, it would undermine the agreement, creating uncertainty for businesses and investors. Companies that have built their supply chains around the USMCA's free trade provisions may rethink their investments in North America, potentially shifting production to regions with more predictable trade policies. In short, a universal tariff on all imports would not just hurt Canada, it would also have serious consequences for the U.S. economy, industries, jobs, and consumers. The deeply interconnected nature of U.S. Canada trade means that any major disruption will send shockwaves through both economies. While Trump argues that these tariffs will protect American jobs and industries, history has shown that trade wars often have unintended consequences. If this policy is enacted, both American and Canadian businesses will need to brace for a period of economic uncertainty, rising costs, and potential job losses. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada has long been built on cooperation, mutual benefit, and trust. For decades, both countries have enjoyed strong diplomatic ties, working together on trade, security, and economic growth. However, Donald Trump's aggressive trade policies have put this relationship under strain. His past actions, including tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, as well as his frequent criticisms of Canada's trade practices, have already caused diplomatic friction. Now, with the possibility of universal tariffs or renewed trade restrictions, tensions between the two nations could escalate even further, potentially damaging one of the strongest international alliances in North America. One of the key areas of strain between the U.S. and Canada has been Trump's America First trade policies. Trump has repeatedly accused Canada of engaging in unfair trade practices, particularly in industries like dairy, lumber, and energy. During his first term, he forced Canada into renegotiating NAFTA, resulting in the United States-Mexico-Canada. While this agreement was meant to provide trade stability, Trump has since suggested that he could push for even more aggressive changes, potentially reopening negotiations or imposing tariffs to force Canada into further concessions. This uncertainty puts businesses in both countries at risk, as companies are unable to make long-term investment decisions without knowing whether trade policies will change again. Another source of tension is Trump's criticism of Canada's defense spending. He has repeatedly called out NATO allies, including Canada, for not meeting the alliance's 2% GDP defense spending target. Trump has even suggested that if countries like Canada do not increase their defense budgets, they should not expect U.S. protection in times of crisis. This rhetoric has alarmed Canadian officials who fear that an increasingly isolationist U.S. could weaken North American security cooperation. If Trump returns to office and continues to pressure Canada on defense spending, it could further erode trust between the two nations. Trump's use of tariffs as a political tool has also created resentment in Canada. In 2018, his administration imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security concerns. This move was widely criticized, as Canada has long been a strategic ally of the U.S. and not a national security threat. In response, Canada retaliated with counter tariffs, targeting U.S. products like whiskey, ketchup, and agricultural goods. While these tariffs were eventually lifted, the dispute damaged diplomatic relations and left many in Canada questioning the reliability of the U.S. as a trade partner. If Trump moves forward with new tariffs or restrictions, Canada will almost certainly retaliate again. This could lead to another cycle of tit-for-tat economic measures, further straining diplomatic ties. Canada may also seek to strengthen its trade relationships with other nations, such as the European Union and China, in an effort to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market. While this shift would take time, it could mark the beginning of a long-term reduction in economic dependence between the two nations, altering the trade landscape of North America. The potential breakdown in U.S.-Canada trade relations could also have broader geopolitical consequences. Historically, Canada has been one of America's closest allies, supporting the U.S. in military conflicts, intelligence sharing, and global policy initiatives. If economic tensions continue to rise, it could create divisions on other critical issues, such as climate policy, border security, and energy cooperation. A weakened U.S.-Canada alliance could also create opportunities for rival nations, such as China or Russia, to strengthen their influence in North America, something that could have long-term strategic consequences. While Trump's aggressive trade stance is aimed at benefiting American industries, it risks undermining a crucial international relationship. Canada is not only the U.S.'s largest trading partner, but also one of its strongest diplomatic allies. If Trump's policies continue to create friction between the two nations, it could result in a long-lasting shift in economic and political dynamics. The question remains: is a trade war with Canada worth jeopardizing decades of cooperation and stability? One of the most significant consequences of Trump's trade war with Canada is the impact on American consumers and businesses. While his tariffs and trade restrictions are often framed as protective measures to save U.S. jobs and industries, history has shown that such policies frequently backfire, leading to higher costs, job losses, and economic uncertainty. If Trump follows through with his plans for universal tariffs or renewed trade restrictions against Canada, the financial burden will fall directly on American consumers and businesses, who will face rising prices, supply chain disruptions, and potential economic downturns. One of the most immediate effects of tariffs is higher consumer prices. When the U.S. imposes import taxes on Canadian goods, American businesses that rely on those products are forced to pay more. These additional costs are almost always passed down to consumers, leading to higher prices on everyday items. Canadian imports play a crucial role in the U.S. economy, with key goods such as lumber, automobiles, oil, food products, and raw materials all crossing the border daily. If tariffs increase the cost of these imports, American families will feel the impact in higher grocery bills, fuel prices, and retail costs. The automotive industry provides a clear example of how tariffs could increase costs for consumers. American automakers rely heavily on Canadian-made parts and materials to manufacture vehicles. If Trump imposes tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, or auto parts, production costs will rise, forcing manufacturers to either increase car prices or absorb the financial hit, which could lead to layoffs and reduced investment. This could make it harder for American consumers to afford new vehicles, slowing down car sales and negatively impacting the broader economy. The housing market could also be affected. Canada is the largest supplier of softwood lumber to the United States, a critical material used in home construction. Tariffs on Canadian lumber would drive up building costs, making homes more expensive for buyers. The U.S. housing market has already been struggling with affordability issues, and additional price increases could make homeownership even more difficult for millions of Americans. Higher lumber costs could also impact businesses in the furniture and construction industries, leading to job losses and slower economic growth. Beyond consumers, small businesses would face major challenges under new trade restrictions. Many American companies, particularly in the manufacturing and retail sectors, depend on affordable Canadian imports to keep their operations running smoothly. If tariffs raise the cost of these goods, businesses may be forced to cut jobs, reduce investments, or even close altogether. Small and mid-sized businesses, which often have narrow profit margins, would be hit the hardest as they have fewer resources to absorb higher costs. Another major concern is supply chain disruptions. The U.S. and Canada have deeply integrated economies with supply chains that stretch across the border. Many industries rely on just-in-time manufacturing, meaning that materials and products are shipped exactly when needed to reduce storage costs. If tariffs slow down trade or make imports prohibitively expensive, companies will have to restructure their supply chains, leading to delays, shortages, and inefficiencies. The recent global supply chain disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated how fragile these systems can be, and new tariffs could create another wave of economic instability. Energy prices could also rise if Trump imposes tariffs on Canadian oil and gas. The U.S. imports significant amounts of crude oil from Canada, particularly from Alberta's oil sands. If tariffs increase the cost of this energy supply, it could lead to higher gasoline prices, affecting transportation, logistics, and household budgets. Given the importance of affordable energy to the economy, this could slow economic growth and reduce consumer spending power. While Trump argues that tariffs protect American jobs, the reality is that past trade wars have often led to job losses instead of gains. When the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018, American manufacturers that use these materials faced higher costs, forcing some to cut jobs or move production overseas. If another round of tariffs is introduced, industries that rely on Canadian imports, including automotive, construction, retail, and manufacturing, could face similar consequences, ultimately leading to fewer jobs and weaker economic growth. In the end, American consumers and businesses will bear the brunt of Trump's trade war with Canada. While tariffs may be intended to punish foreign competitors, they often end up harming domestic industries and raising costs for everyday Americans. If new trade restrictions are imposed, the U.S. economy could face higher inflation, supply chain chaos, and potential job losses, making it clear that the consequences of this trade war would extend far beyond the negotiating table.